So, what is an obsessive thought? By Google description, an obsessive thought is an obsession that are represented in thoughts, urges, or mental images that are intrusive, unwanted, and make people anxious. Common obsessions include fear of germs, contamination. Yeah, that's not what we want. It was a nice try though, but we still have the same question. What is an obsessive thought? So, what is an obsessive thought? Okay, even though this Google description is not our answer, there are some things here that can actually help us to try to get a little bit closer to our mission of trying to understand what an obsessive thought actually is. They make a clear division of what an obsessive thought actually is by dividing it into three things: thoughts, visual images, and urges. But I'd like to add one of my own that I, to be honest, think it's one of the most important ones so that we fully understand what an obsessive thought is. But first, let's try to explain what these three actually are. Okay, but what do they actually mean by thoughts and why is it different from the other three? So, by description, a thought is a verbal representation of the anxieties and fears that you might have. It's like a voice in your head always repeating the same things over and over again. Saying things that you already worry about or just think about. For example, your work, school, loving relationships, or even just games. By statistics, verbal thoughts are one of the most common ones. So if this applies to you, don't freak out, it's quite normal to be honest. These verbal thoughts can have a direct impact on your day-to-day life and especially strike right in your anxiety. They can be very impactful, especially by what they actually say and the frequency that they say them. But after all this, how do we actually cope with all these thoughts? ChatGPT has a say in this, but just like Google, it's a whole lot of nothing. So let's actually try to understand how to cope with this. First, it's important to question the things that you're thinking. Most of these thoughts are just built up on top of our anxieties and fears, and they're just going to be an exaggeration of where reality actually is and don't let you see who you actually are. So it's always good to understand that you have them and try to question, is this actually happening? Is this actually worth it to think about now? Or is this what will actually happen? By having those reaffirmations to yourself, you can understand that they carry no value to who you actually are. Another thing that can also help is to try to talk with family and friends, since they will give you a different perspective of what those thoughts actually are and what's the value that they actually carry to you. Now, going to the second representation of these obsessive thoughts, we have the mental images have a different approach from the verbal thoughts, since they're like vivid images of things that, first, things that have happened, second, things that will happen and are just clearly a representation of our fears, and three, just our minds trying to imagine and creating a scenario obviously built on top of these fears and anxieties that we might have in our lives. Even though it may not sound, these are actually very common, being the second one that is like the most common compared with the other two that I mentioned. And they can also impact your day-to-day life in a very influential way, just like the verbal thoughts. But just like everything in life, there's a way to fix them and try to cope with them. A good way to cope with these mental images is just to try to create a distraction. I know it might sound a little bit easier said than done, but to be honest, just trying to play a video game or trying to talk with some friends, when you realize that those images are not leaving your mind and are just causing you to ruin the mood of that day, it can really help. And even though it's not a direct fix of it, it really will help you to try to just get your mind over it. It's really important also to give yourself some time to actually think about them and to understand where all those images come from and what they actually mean to you. Because just distracting yourself from them is like putting a band-aid on top of the scar, but it's really important for you to give yourself some time to actually heal and understand how to properly heal them. Okay, now talking probably about the hardest one, the urges. Urges most of the times are just extensions of the two things we mentioned before. They can also be the need to do specific things. There's a slight difference from addictions and these urges that we're talking about, and those being mostly the intensity of these needs and the actual action that we take on top of these needs. And the ways they are represented in your life can be the things that you just think about. For example, the urge to play video games, just to never think about anything and just stay away. Alcohol, drugs, cigarettes, any of those needs that sometimes you actually don't necessarily take action on, but you just constantly think about them, they are these urges that we're talking about. This one can have different ways to cope with, like trying to accept your thoughts and not suppressing them or keeping them down. It's gonna be very helpful, and especially not harm yourself because of the fact that you have them. And also another thing that can be extremely helpful is, if you can, obviously try to look for more specific and more professional help on how to properly deal with these urges, since it can be the one that impacts the most your life and can eventually lead into an obsession and like an addiction. All of these things are very common, and if you recognize any of them in you, don't stress or try to think too much about it. The only thing you need to understand is that with time, things will get better and you will stop having those thoughts. But even with all these thoughts, ideas, and descriptions, we get to this complex description of what an obsessive thought actually is. Maybe obsessive thoughts are just those thoughts that you can't stop thinking about right before you close your eyes and try to fall asleep. Thank you for watching.
I think of you all the time. Now that you're gone, I've been doing all kinds of drugs to get you out